I just, I will shorten it because I had a chance to hear some of the comments, but I think where are we in terms of engaging men in gender equality? I think we've heard several presentations during the course of yesterday and earlier today around the backlash, and we do see it in multi-country surveys that we've carried out. And particularly finding a lot of this contradiction of many young men supporting gender equality in the abstract, but still believing and pulling into a harmful version of masculinity or toxic masculinity. And I think the other truth that we've seen from looking across more than 45 national surveys is just how much early experiences of what boys see in the home, whether involve fatherhood or whether they see violence, coming from a male in the home, how much those play ahead. And I think we've not used that very much to think about our policies. And then finally, I think we also need to look at the fact that when men support gender equality, they tend to be happier and healthier when they buy into these other versions of manhood. And I think that's something we need to pull out as well and to use in terms of promoting our policies. The next slide, please. I can't control them from here, so if you can click on there. One of the things that we have tried to do is to make visible the harm to men themselves, and particularly to young men, as we see a lot of backlash coming from that direction. This survey that we carried out called the Man Box of young men ages 18 to 30, partners in the US, Mexico, UK, Australia, Jamaica, finding that some 30 to 40% of young men fall into what we call this harmful version of masculinity, of only being able to show anger, using force to get what they want, not showing vulnerability, believing they're always in charge. At the same time, lots of those young men buying into gender equality, again, in the abstract, thinking women are their equals. Next slide, please. But what we find is that the more you're in the box of those 40%, of men that I mentioned, more or less, you're more likely to have thought about suicide, to have drink in harmful amounts, to been in traffic accidents, to show depression, to use violence, to experience violence, and also to use violence against women and girls at very high rates, such that we have enough data to say, look, we should call this out for what it is. It's harmful to our health as men, and it's harmful to the health of women. Now, interestingly, one thing is that the guys who are in the box are also more likely to say they're happy. So I think this goes to some of the points that Christian made yesterday, which is that men are finding some sense of I'm living up to what the world expects of me if I'm in the box. So again, we've got the challenge of how to help men see this huge contradiction. Next slide. One of the ways that we've tried to also, and if you could just click on to the next one, and this was the answer to the question from the beginning, we also did a health economics analysis of this, of the population attribution that we can say how much of health costs, lost life, and lost work are associated with these harmful norms. And just among young men ages 18 to 30, that is not the wider population of men, and just across those 6 health outcomes that I mentioned, the cost came, and if you'll click on to the next one, it should come up. It came to nearly 16 billion US dollars. To put that in perspective, that is about the budget of our Centers for Disease Control in the US in pre-COVID times. That is more than the NBA makes in revenue. That is the National Basketball Association. In the UK, it came up to about 4 billion US dollars, which is more than the Brits spend on tea every year. So it's a huge cost, at least, that we can say is associated with being kind of believing into these harmful norms. And I think these are important to help bring the cost to men themselves of harmful ideas about masculinity and hold out a promise of healthier, more connected masculinity. Next, please, and I want to move quickly because I know we're a little bit behind. I think we've got a challenge of how to convince the younger generation, and these are obvious data that we have there in the EU, that gender equality hasn't been achieved. And I think we see the fatigue from some men saying, oh, we've done this forever, we've achieved it, and whether data from several countries in Europe showing that up to half of young men or men think that gender equality has come too far. So I think we've got a challenge of how to make the case that no, in fact, we're not done with it, and we need to continue to do work on it that's not just kind of vaguely making noise about it with a few male champions. We need bigger action that continues to convince and engage men on this. Next one, please. And try to get toward closing. I think Christian did a fantastic job yesterday of talking about really the most angry men. But I think the issue is not just to focus on the most extremes of that, but to imagine and to understand just how many young men are looking at some point on Jordan Peterson's website or on the Men Going Their Own Way spaces and others where, these are not other men. And I think we sometimes in our progressive policies and views tend to put these men way out there instead of saying they're us. We've got to reach out to them, talk to them, have dialogue that doesn't just push us back into the polarization. Next one, please. And I think we had a lot of conversation about care work, and Nikki from our team talked about the Men Care campaign and some of our conclusions from there. And I think we've done fantastic conversations in Europe and beyond about paternity leave and how do we get men to take it up. But I think we've got to go further than that. I'm encouraged by something of a 5-country study we just did with Oxfam around caregiving during COVID, which on the one hand shows that inequality continues, but that men are doing more. And interestingly, across those 5 countries that included middle and lower income and upper income countries, is that men are reporting they're happier. In spite of this economic stress, many men reporting they're happier than before COVID if they're home caring for their children. So I think there is something about how do we engage men into caregiving as something that is good for us as well, and bringing men into the broader care agenda that's not just the care of our biological children, but also in terms of supporting paid care work, being the voters for childcare the way that women have historically been. Bringing men into elder care. In the US, men are doing 40% of the care of elders. How do we make that more visible and part of caregiving that says this is part of your life? You cannot separate this from your identity. Next one, please. Move to concluding. I think we also have to talk about men's vulnerabilities in health and do it in a way that is not oppositional. It's not about calling attention or taking away from attention to women's health or children's health. It is to say we need to think about men's health as well. If I look at where I live in Washington, D.C., white men have, that is me, has an average life expectancy 17 years longer than African American men in Washington, D.C. And men of all races having lower life expectancy than women in quite dramatic ways, not 17 years, but 5 to 6 years. I think we need to be able to talk about those men's health vulnerabilities without those becoming pitted against women's health, and to look at why they matter for women as well. And then specific groups of men who, ethnic minority men, low-income men, we need to be able to call out their needs without that turning into the polarization and the fights that we often see. So concluding, I know that we've got to get on to the next session. If you'll click onto the next slide. I do think we've got to think about national care plans and policies that go beyond paternity leave. I think we need national men's health agendas that are linked, not separate from women's health and children's health. We need national campaigns to engage male allyship from much earlier. We're starting far too late in our work. We need to work in our national plans of violence prevention that think about primary prevention again at the early stages. If we know that boys who witness violence at home are 3 times more likely to use it as adults when they grow up, we've got to think about the kind of psychosocial support that must start earlier and targeted to particularly boys who may be at greater risk later on. Data collection to know where men are on these things, I think we need to do much more frequently. And finally, to engage allies. We can't do this only with policy. We've been doing some work recently with the Gina Davis Institute around looking at what boys are seeing in television and finding that they're seeing women in positions of power, but they're seeing very unhealthy masculinity presented in the shows that they're most watching, particularly now during COVID. They're seeing men who only can present anger, who aren't involved in caregiving, and when they are shown as mostly incapable or incompetent caregivers. So we've got a huge, I think, we've got a huge need to engage broader society, particularly the media that boys are spending a huge amount of time on, to start even earlier, to call men into a relational way of being men, not a performatic way of being men. So I really do see a pathway forward to think, how do we start far earlier with this, and how do we engage more allies? How do we step away from some of the polarization to show men the benefits when we embrace gender equality? Thank you, and so sorry for the connectivity issues.